I'm going to now introduce Dr. Ackerly. He's a climate change biologist and professor in the departments of integrative biology and environmental science, policy and management at UC Berkeley. He's also the dean of the Rosser College of Natural Resources at UC Berkeley. His research group studies the impact of climate change on biodiversity in California and post-fire forest dynamics in mixed hardwood and oak woodlands. He co-leads, and returning back to Wade's remarks in terms of the biodiversity and how Dr. Ackerly has helped shape thinking in California. He co-leads the Terrestrial Biodiversity Climate Change Collaborative, and this collaboration has helped develop high resolution projections for future climate in California. And the group works with land managers, NGO, the state agencies, and the National Park Service to consider new approaches to manage vegetation in the face of changing conditions. Dr. Ackerly.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a real honor to speak both after Secretary Crowfoot. Thank you for those introductory remarks framing the very big picture that this work takes the bigger context of all of our work. And thanks to the organizers for this opportunity to give this opening talk today. And I'm looking forward to hearing the speakers coming up on a range of related topics. So let me just make sure my slides advance, that would be good. Yes, okay, to reiterate Secretary Crowfoot's remarks, and I think this is an audience that doesn't need any reminder that we live in a spectacular biodiversity hotspot. I am a plant ecologist, so this is my my vision of the beauties of California biodiversity. Many of you probably have your own favorite organisms and habitats spanning this remarkable state. We're also a biodiversity data hotspot. And what I mean by that is specifically the data itself. We have extraordinary historical collections and some of the world's leaders in databasing, as well as developing citizen science, such as iNaturalist, which is based right here in California. And we are a hotspot of land conservation. We have, as Secretary Crowfoot said, by some measure, somewhere to around 22 to 23% of the state at a high level of protection. And that's an incredible foundation to go forward as we move forward in this century. I want to make many of you, I'm sure, have seen these slides before. The drought doesn't seem quite as much the crisis of a few years ago when this would dominate all of our talks on this topic, although this year is not looking so great either. But the first thing to see, just looking at these images, is just the reminder of the spatial patterns in vegetation and habitat are so strongly linked to climate. And here you're just seeing it by the color of the land surface, and of course seeing the distribution of forests. And this is the foundations of a lot of biogeography and ecology. Is just we know that plants and animals are incredibly sensitive to climate, the habitats they form. And this sets up the spatial patterns across the globe. And those spatial patterns provide a lot of the information and the foundations for our understanding of how biodiversity may respond over time. The images of the snowpack there, of course, just remind us of the very high year-to-year variability in California's weather that over time accumulates into long-term changing climate at different scales. So to set a stage, as we think about biodiversity conservation, our population at 40 million now and projected to reach 50 million, although I've heard some shifts in that as we actually begin to see more people leaving for any number of reasons in recent years. So we'll see when that 50 million might come. Rapidly changing demographics, no racial or ethnic group in this state is a majority. And in that way, we are a foreshadow of what the entire nation will look like in the future. As we do accommodate more and more people, we have a very important set of choices to make about densifying the metropolises versus continued expansion into suburban and rural residential landscapes. And specifically, we can of course think about that in terms of the wildland-urban interface and the threats that sets up the threats to structures and infrastructure of wildfire. We are in the midst of a remarkable transition to a low carbon economy, which will change how we do business in so many ways. And while all of that is going on, we of course will feel the effects of a globally changing climate that reflect greenhouse gas emissions around the world. This is not something that we control ourselves. As climate gets warmer, rainfall regimes change, fire regimes are shifting, and being in a semi-arid part of the world, this all plays out against the preeminent importance of water and water availability and how that interacts across the entire landscape from urban out into working landscapes and natural lands. I don't need to remind anyone here that the challenge we're dealing with is largely driven by our continuing emissions of fossil fuels, which are on this steady uptick. This goes to a 2019 projection. I think when COVID first hit and the economy really tightened up, we saw the decreased emissions for 2020. But I think once we see those numbers play out, I think it's going to be rather sobering, the extent to even when all of us felt such a huge impacts of how we go about doing our daily business. A lot of the CO2 emissions continued. And of course, a lot of that is because food was still being delivered to our stores. We're still heating our homes, maybe our homes rather than our offices, but this is still rather inexorable given the dependence we still have in our transportation systems and our infrastructure on CO2. We of course hope to turn that around. Now, as we look ahead to this century, there's different ways of looking at these trends. I find this one somewhat useful. The x-axis here is the total cumulative emissions of CO2, and starting from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And the y-axis is the change in temperature relative to a historical baseline. So what you see here is these black points bring us up to 2010, and then if we had continued it out up here to 2020, this is what we've actually observed. And then the question really is, how far do we go? Where do we get to when we will curtail and stop emitting more and more CO2? The important point of this graph is just to see what a strong, essentially linear relationship it is between the total amount of CO2 we put out and the total change in global temperature that we will eventually experience. So this is our option set to choose. Where do we want to fall across this, along this band of possibilities? Just to briefly summarize, I know much of this was talked about yesterday, especially historical trends. So let's look ahead to the future. Temperatures will rise. Since we're at a mid-latitude, the average rise in California is similar to global averages. The Arctic is higher, other parts are cooler, but we're right around tracking global rise. Inland areas will warm more than the coast. The ocean is a significant buffer, and this means that the spatial gradients that habitats are structured along will change in how steep they are, how big the differences are between climate in different places. We can be very confident that rainfall will continue to be highly variable from year to year, as it has been historically and in our historic record and before. Averages may shift a little bit, but that variability will play out against warmer temperatures. And one effect of that, of course, is the decreasing snowpack, increasing intensity of the summer dry season, where the lack of rain in summer is coupled with higher temperatures, also driving fire frequencies. And then one of our very distinctive features is the coastal fog, which can be very important for coastal habitats. And that may be one feature of the climate where we still have quite a bit of uncertainty to understand both the complexity of mechanisms and the trends. There's some trends that have been there's some trends at some locations and then go to other locations and they seem a little different, and it's a difficult one to model. So that will be locally relevant to habitats along the coast. So what I want to talk about today is to run through examples of biodiversity responses to changing climates at different timescales, and you'll hear more about them. And some of these are very familiar, a couple new ones possibly. Then really, I hope to spend a little bit of time talking about indicators and how to interpret indicators in relation to how natural systems respond to climate change, and also how what we're measuring has embedded within it the effects of some of our interventions that are already underway, and how I think it's important for us to think about that. And then I'll talk a little bit about our conservation strategies at the very end. So the first timescale in which we have great evidence of the effects of climate change on biodiversity is a geologic time across the Pleistocene and the changes that have occurred since the last glacial maximum. Clear Lake is one of the preeminent locations for this kind of work. It's a very old and stable lake surrounded by these forests, and those trees shed pollen. Pollen falls on the lake surface and falls to the bottom, and then can be drilled and brought up, and you get the historical sequence of what those habitats have looked like over time. Many of you may have seen this before. It's remarkable to contemplate. If we go to the last glacial maximum at 17,000 years ago, the forests were almost entirely coniferous. And then over a period of just about 2,000 years, we transitioned to almost entirely oak woodlands with a minority of, well, actually 60 to 70%, so we should say, oak mixed with conifers. So this is our first piece of evidence. This has been known for a long time about how sensitive vegetation is to a changing climate, and also reminds us that the importance here is both how much climate changes, but especially how fast it changes. Given 2,000 or 3,000 years, we know that vegetation can make very dramatic changes, and we would think of our current vegetation as healthy vegetation in many changes occur, and what are we likely to see when climate changes much faster than in this century than it did coming out of the last glacial maximum. So I also just want you to picture what that means. And these are just two photos taken of a conifer forest and an oak woodland in California. It's not the same location, but I think it's easy to look at pollen diagrams and think, oh, that's a long time ago. But we need to, as ecologists, like get on the ground and think about what that looks like. This is a significant change for a pine forest to become an oak woodland. And of course, that meant there was a lot of mortality, a lot of recruitment, a lot of dynamics going on. And one question we're thinking about is, what did that mortality look like as we came out of the ice ages? And of course, it might have looked like what we're seeing now. So those conifer forests were in places that were becoming too warm. And we can only imagine that most likely similar events occurred where there was an unusual drought against the background of the changing climate, widespread mortality, and that sets the stage then for a transition to a different vegetation. And I'll come back to that towards the end. The second timescale that's been incredibly valuable for us is about the century-long timescale, and this is largely because in California we're fortunate to have two extraordinary early 20th century data sets, the Grinnell Vertebrate Survey and Professor Beisinger, I'll speak about that more later, and the Wieslander vegetation mapping. Jim Thorne, who's hosting the next session, has done a lot of work on the Wieslander. And having those kinds of baseline data on the scale of a century is really exceptional. This has been one of the indicators frequently discussed, is the evidence from the Grinnell project of shifting elevational distributions. We see a number of small mammal species in the Yosemite region, where these green show uphill movement into habitats that they did not live in back 100 years ago. These red on the bottom here show contraction, where species have disappeared from lower elevational ranges. But the constant reminder when we're dealing with biodiversity that species, there's a diversity of responses. So we see species that have contracted from upper elevations or expanded into lower elevations. And this is, of course, one of the great challenges in biodiversity indicators is we see lots of change, we see diversity across species. And if we think of it in the same terms that Professor Santer used of first detecting change, in a climate sense, we try to detect change and attribute it to human activity. With biodiversity, we want to detect change and then link it to climate. And then indirectly, of course, we are linking it to anthropogenic effects because we have independently attributed the changing climate to human activity. So it's literally at least a two-step process. Now, these are the patterns that are consistent with being driven by climate. But in terms of attribution, we would also want to couple it with understanding the mechanisms, the biology of each species, and some of the subsequent Grinnell work has done that quite beautifully to be able to look at the physiology, especially recent work on birds, where the physiology gives us the mechanistic understanding that these patterns are not only consistent with climate change, but we have a strong evidence for attribution to climate change in terms of underlying biological mechanisms. An example of the Wieslander, another example of Wieslander is the ability to see over a century that the density of large trees in our forests have declined dramatically across most regions of the state. At the same time, densities of small trees increased. This is a pattern familiar to forest ecologists in the West. A lot of it has to do with fire suppression and these sequences as we see forests fill in. But we were also able to detect the signal in California that the decline in the large trees is greater in the areas that have experienced a greater shift in underline climatic water deficits, the measure of the summer, the intensity of the summer drought. So we have both a management component and a climate component that we have evidence are responsible for changes in forest structure. Professor Stevens will talk later, and this is of course part of our understanding of changing fire regimes. Another Wieslander example, and this is work from Jim Thorne, is evidence of species moving uphill on the western slope of the Sierra, the contraction of ponderosa pine, the red, where they existed historically and have contracted and been replaced by oak woodlands, especially at that elevation. Black oak is very important. And again, consistent with our predictions of climate change, it's exactly what we, in terms of elevational movement, and then we have to couple it with our knowledge of the physiology of these plants, our knowledge of drought tolerance and heat tolerance, and the underlying mechanisms to get to that next step of feeling confident in the attribution. And there are, especially maybe the main thing that we're always thinking about is how to link these trends to land use as well, and land use change, which has also been very dramatic over this century. The third timescale that's really important is really the span of one investigator's lifetime, and this is the data. Davis, again, familiar to many here, where one dedicated observer, together with students and collaborators, has been able to see these trends on the decadal timescale. In this case, about 30 years of butterflies are flying earlier in the season, the date of first flight. This is very strongly linked to changes in winter temperature. And of course, part of what's going on here is there's a slow change in winter temperature, but against that is the year-to-year variability that we expect as a normal part of our climate system. And when we add the variability, we can see how strong that linkage is, and also seeing declining populations. And I'll come back to that in a couple minutes. And then the fourth timescale is the one of extreme acute events. And again, I showed this picture earlier, effects of drought. And we have conducted some additional work recently on this with blue oaks. A lot of the work has been on conifers, but my lab was able to look also at the Forest Service flyover data sets where they observe dieback of different species and pull out the oak data. These areas in purple show the regions of really extensive blue oak dieback during the last drought in the Southern Sierra. And what's important, a little hard to see here, this graph's on the bottom. The x-axis is the long-term average precipitation. The y-axis is the precipitation during the drought. So any point below this dashed line shows how extreme the drought was in that location. And what we see here is that the dieback occurred, there were two conditions necessary for dieback. One is it's at the dry end of the species range, but even among the locations at the dry end of the range, it's the places that also experienced an extreme drought anomaly. So here we have places up here that were a very extreme drought anomaly, but they're wetter overall, and we didn't see dieback there. So both historical climate and the magnitude of the drought event are both contributing to a picture of where we see dieback for a species like blue oak. Okay, here's a couple points I just want to share about my thinking about indicators. I'm very open to discussion about this. One thing about nature is very dynamic and very adaptive, and this is the essence of natural evolution by natural selection, changing communities. When climate changes, plants and animals will respond, and they respond in ways often that are going to help them survive. That's the essence of what evolution has done, is to shape the ability of plants and animals to respond to changing conditions. So if you look at this image here, here's two people that are lying down on a very hot day. So that's my indicator. Here's an indicator that it was a really hot day, obviously not a climate indicator. And yet these two people are telling us very different stories. This person has sought out shade to get some relief and then rest. And if you don't move as much, you won't overheat and you can get by on a very hot day. This person is suffering heat stroke. So these two people who are lying down are actually giving us very different indicators, or we need to look at them in different ways in terms of what it tells us about how the system is responding. And specifically, this is clearly a very negative health impact, whereas this is a very smart adaptive response to get through hot conditions. It turns out that this is exactly what's happening in natural systems. So here's some a more recent work on the butterflies, Art Shapiro's butterfly data, and Forrester at now University of Nevada, Reno has been leading this work. And what we see here is the x-axis is how much change there's been in when the butterfly, the first flight, the date of first flight. The y-axis is change in abundance. So the species that are changing the most in their date of first flight, and the negatives mean they're flying earlier as spring gets warming, are actually more resilient. In fact, they're increasing in abundance. Whereas species down at this end that are not changing are more likely to be either stable or if they're changing less. So the earlier flight is an indicator of climate change, but an indicator doesn't mean it's an indicator that a species is suffering. And I think it's incredibly important in natural systems that we distinguish sort of indicators that to us are a signal that climate really is driving change versus indicators that show it's a negative impact on that system, for example, with a change in abundance. And a lot of the responses we are going to see, in fact, may be adaptive responses on the part of natural systems. So again, going back to that, that hypothetical of a conifer forest going through a mortality event and potentially converting to a drought-tolerant oak woodland, this is a very dramatic indicator of that drought event. If that change were to occur, and this could take centuries. So the problem here again is the rate of change. This forest would presumably be more resilient to oak woodland, more resilient to subsequent droughts or warmer temperatures in terms of storing carbon, in terms of a setting for greater biodiversity. If the oaks never arrived, we would probably have wave after wave after wave of conifer death because it's gotten too hot, for example. So we always have to think about the mortality itself is like, this is a crisis. We have all these dead trees, we have fire danger, we have carbon loss, we need to deal with that. We also need to think about how that is part of what could be an inevitable set of changes in natural systems that then could make them more resilient, potentially. The second point I wanted to offer about indicators, and this is, I'm not sure I've made the best diagram here, so bear with me. So imagine that we're watching an indicator over time and it changes. And I'm making it negative here, which suggests it's bad. That's just because we're all in the habit of having, I guess, positive is good and negative is bad on our y-axis, but of course it would matter what the actual thing we're measuring is. And let's imagine that over 50 years, we watch this indicator change. And it turns out over those 50 years, there was 2 degrees of warming. It also turns out that we invested a lot in landscape connectivity, for example. And let's say this is a wildlife species. So the observed change is the change that we see in response to, say, 2 degrees of warming. And it reflects whatever beneficial effects there were of adaptation. I mean this by social adaptation efforts, or more social adaptation, actually. For example, expanding our parks. So the climate indicators, the climate system is largely external to our control, and we can just, and we see them changing. The biotic indicators have a lot to do with our ability to intervene. So there could have been another degree of change if we had not made adaptation investments, if we had not increased connectivity. Then we might have expected that species would suffer more. So what we're observing has always built into it any potential beneficial effects of our early interventions. And furthermore, what if the 2 degrees change is because we actually did succeed to some degree in mitigation, and it might have been 4 degrees of change. So there's always this counterfactual that we have to keep in mind. What would have happened had we not intervened? And what we observe is, as an observed impact or an observed change in an indicator, we can think of as a potential or a predicted change, then minus, and I mean by minus meaning this is a big effect, and we subtract in a beneficial way the benefits of mitigation efforts, and we subtract again the benefits of adaptation efforts and get to the observed change. And the reason I wanted to bring this up here is because I know there's parallel discussions going on about resilience indicators and how can we measure the benefits of our investments. And often that is going to require the construction of counterfactual scenarios of what would have happened had we not intervened. This is exactly analogous to the climate modeling work that models what would have happened to climate without CO2, which is a counterfactual because what's really happening includes the CO2 effect. And then it's the difference between those that becomes key to our attribution efforts. So I don't know, I have no suggestions right now on how we can do this. Building models of what might have happened is extremely difficult relative to what does happen over time. But at least conceptually, we need to keep in mind that our indicators have embedded within them the potential beneficial effects of any investments we can make over time. So just to very briefly highlight how we think about conservation in a changing, under changing conditions and a changing climate. I think of this sometimes with this conserve, connect, and change, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Land at the outset, the protection of natural habitats and working landscapes is, even in urban settings or suburban settings like this, of course, there can be a lot of biodiversity spread all across these landscapes, is the key. If without providing habitat for native plants and animals, our efforts to conserve them will, of course, be extremely difficult or unsuccessful. So at the heart of this is conservation, and Secretary Crowfoot spoke about the governor's recent executive order. This is wonderful that we've made this commitment in California to 30% conservation of 30% of land and coastal waters by 2030. If you haven't been on these recently updated websites from state government and a new network that we've launched of university and NGO partners and tribal groups and agencies as well, to provide a lot of the science backup for this work. So we're incredibly excited to be leaning in to support the state in pursuit of these goals. We have great, this is some work from my lab from a couple years ago, where we wanted to look at the current landscape in terms of how intact is the landscape, and therefore the potential value for biodiversity, but also look at the places that are masking out the places that are already protected to get to a map of where the opportunities are. And these dark blue areas and the darker green show us the areas that are both fairly intact, but also not protected. Now, protected here means formal protection, for example, through parks and open space. But again, we really have to lean in and think very hard about how we acknowledge and embrace and include all of the biodiversity value of working lands that can be in private hands that may not show up in a formal analysis as formally protected, but we know are very valuable. Now, those working land, quick point. We all, the land use and habitat loss have been the primary threats to biodiversity. That will not change. It's going to, maybe climate will exceed it if we can put a number on it. But of course, all of this plays out against our continuing challenge, especially of expanding housing, and a similar challenge, but one that really, I think, for everyone who cares a lot about making this transition to a low energy, a low carbon economy, then we really have to grapple with these problems where the energy technologies that might help us in that also have habitat impacts, and how do we find the joint solution that's best across both of these challenges and goals. A second strategy that my lab thinks about a lot is the importance of conserving rugged landscapes. We think of this as conserving the stage. And here you see chaparral next to blue oak woodland and next to a nice mixed hardwood of bays and coast live oak. And the fact that we have these evergreens right next to a chaparral patch reflects the north and south facing slopes, underlying water availability. And when we have when our open space and parks have these heterogeneous landscapes, it sets up greater potential for plants and animals to be able to make small scale movements on a daily or a decadal or century long time scale that will make it easier for them to survive and not require very, very long distance dispersal. Now, for some species, the dispersal will be important. So the second theme of our is to really work to expand our work on landscape connectivity, just indicated here by a riparian zone that could connect some open space up here, potentially to another park or open space further downstream. Riparian is especially valuable because rivers run downhill, and therefore these corridors will intrinsically allow species to move towards higher elevations, if that's in fact what is how that species will respond to changing conditions. But there's a lot of excellent science now, and again, California, we've done lots of great work in California to model and find landscape connectivity priorities that address both short-term importance of gene flow as well as the long-term importance of shifts in response to a changing climate. And finally, this question of managing for change. This one is the one that is most challenging, I think, for many of us, which is after a major disturbance, such as a fire, or even in the absence of disturbances, if we look at that ice age picture, there are some changes that are inevitable. 2 or 3 degrees of warming is going to mean that some habitats will eventually shift, and major vegetation will shift. Do we want to actively facilitate those changes? And how do we embrace the fact that some of these changes may be inevitable? And not only inevitable, but those new systems with different species will be more resilient in a future climate. And of course, this brings us into discussions of assisted migration, of restoration or pre-storation, as it's been called, which is restoring for the future, not restoration as trying to go back. And as conservation biologists and land managers and restoration ecologists, these discussions are the ones that I think will be rapidly becoming more widespread, more engaged, and more challenging as we balance the multiple goals of conserving historic biodiversity, as well as making sure we have resilient landscapes in the future. So I'll stop there. This summarizes the main points. And I am new to Slack, but I did get it set up. And anyone who wants to jump onto the Slack channel, I'll try to be responsive there, but I know the program is going to continue on for the day. Thank you again for the invitation to speak.